I think, the use of an AI that can be developed completely transparently in the open among any group of countries, and it can start with the US and China. And that AI has to be built for the purposes of absorbing, all of the rules and values that the countries have already established, and exploit the polymathic nature of the machine to do what humans have never been able to do, which is to find the points where you can reconcile these things in important areas.
Good evening. My name is Sam Altman. I'm the co-founder of OpenAI. This is a real pleasure tonight to get to interview my dear friend and one of our closest advisors from very early on in OpenAI, Craig Mundie. And we're going to talk about his book, Genesis. We're also going to try to talk generally about AI and what's happening and what it takes to get this to go well for the world, not just as a technology problem, but as this sort of complex thing that's going to touch all these aspects of society. But to start, I thought it might be fun to begin where Craig and I met, which was at a conference in, I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2016, 17, 18?
2018, maybe.
All right, 2018. And I was telling Craig that I was excited. We were working on AI, and it was before anything was working, but at that point, I felt reasonably confident. It was in the kind of GPT maybe 1 or 2 days, and I was like, I think this is maybe going to be pretty good. And I remember Craig saying something, well, look, I don't know how well it's going to work or how long the technology is going to take, but have you thought about this issue and that issue and that one and that one? And I was like, oh, those are interesting views on questions that I don't hear too often, so let's start talking. And that began a relationship of thinking through the set of challenges, technical, but mostly beyond technical, and how they all interrelate about what's going to happen with AI. So I'd love to start with how you think about the problem now, how your thinking has evolved these last 6 years, and what people need to know about where we are, the challenges in front of us, and what it's going to take to get to the sort of promised land here.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for that introduction, remembering our beginning. It was interesting. We went to a conference together where the topic was to talk about sort of the moral issues associated with this, and this was 6 and 7 years ago. And now today we find ourselves where people are coming around to realize, wow, there's a whole bunch of issues that relate to the emergence of these super intelligent systems, and we have to think about them more. For me, the evolution started in that plane flight where you and I had that discussion, and then when I started working with you and the team there, it was clear that OpenAI had a very sort of devoted focus on these questions. At the time we called them safety and alignment, making it good for humanity. And I would come down from Seattle, and after a little while I'd say, it's great, but this all seems kind of tactical, and there's all these other issues, who's working on them? And Sam said, well, we're kind of just trying to make it work right now. And I said, okay. And he assigned somebody to work with me every time I came down, just to brainstorm these other questions. And it didn't take too long before the two of us that were talking decided, we couldn't think of a way ultimately to control the AI as it became super intelligent, except by somehow using another AI in the process. And so we started to think about that, and things went on. And what happened for me was I realized that whether I talked to the OpenAI people or government people or other people doing work, for example, all my friends at Microsoft, I realized that no one was really kind of connecting all the dots necessary to think you're going to end up with a solution that'll allow this to be a successful relationship in the long term between the machines and the humans. And I thought, okay, this is something I could add value to. And so in the background for the last 4 years or so, I contemplated that question. And the book, at least in abstract terms at the end, talks a bit about where I came out on that, which includes a technical component, but also the legal component and the policy component and the diplomacy component and other things, which no one really tends to put together in one place. So the history I had with Henry in particular, but Eric to some degree, led to the book that you have here.
Where do you think we are in the process of both these systems and sort of their current technical capabilities, and also getting towards a solution like the one you outline in the book?
Well, I think the reason the book says that there's some urge.
A pretty optimistic, although urgent note.
Yes. No, I mean, in the end, we're optimistic because we can see a path to deal with all these questions, despite, a much more turbulent geopolitical environment. Henry, of course, was a great tutor in this regard, and we were close friends for 25 years. And, when you think back, Henry was among the few people who came up, for example, with a strategy for nuclear nonproliferation. And that didn't begin until each country, the Soviet Union and the United States, had enough nuclear weapons to blow the world up 3 times over. And then they realized, wow, we might not shoot at each other anymore, but if we don't figure out how to control this thing, we might have other problems. And so it was the tutelage from Henry to think about those class of problems that led us to try to put this book together. And so what's happening now is that the technical work and the application of it is accelerating way faster than the parties who have to work on these other parts, which is to some extent the government, but I think also the academy. And it has to be done in a more unified way on not a global basis, but at least you have to find some coalition of the willing from a country point of view that realize, wow, we better figure this out ourselves, and get organized around it. That part I don't think is happening. While there's a lot of government activity, in part because the entreaty from the companies to say, well, we're going to need some kind of regulation. Problem is we didn't tell them what kind of regulation or exactly how to do it. And in my own experience, they can be very well intentioned, but since they're not expert in the field and they often have a tough time anticipating what's going to happen, it's hard to get that right. So I think there's a necessary collaboration between the people building it and the people ultimately helping to create the governance around it. And that's not happening, in my mind, nearly at the pace that's required. And so the book is a bit of an urgent call for people to step back, in a sense, much like they did back in the nuclear weapons era, where they said, we need to step back and get some group of countries to come together and figure out what do we really want to do about containing this. And in this part, this thing is broader in its implications. It's going to change everything about everything over time, and how to get the governments to kind of get on a line where some of them are at least working toward this, I'll call it this big architecture of safety. And to me, maybe we didn't use the word as much in the book as I feel about it now, but the real issue is trust. People often ask me, they say, well, you're optimistic, but if you believe that this is going to have this level of capability, the implication is humans are going to cede a lot of decisions on a workaday basis, but also on broader basis to these super intelligent machines. But how do we get comfortable with that? And at the end of the day, it's going to be a trust question, and we have to figure out how does that trust emerge.
ChatGPT went down yesterday. First time in a while. And I had to work without it for 4 hours. And I had kind of forgotten how to do that. And it really did make me think, like, man, we're going to be relying on these systems more and more and more. And this is like...
It's sort of the ultimate.
It was a crazy cascading thing because, like, at the time we most needed tools to, like, help us solve a problem, we didn't have it. The thing was just broken.
It's like the ultimate critical infrastructure utility, for the world. It's just the world's just getting warmed up on it now. But yes, as has happened with all the other computing and cloud services and electricity and telephony and others, when it goes down, the world stops.
Speaking of the sort of trust question, I think seeding decision making at a high level, actually, I hope we don't do, but you relying on it more and more. I am amazed at how quickly it's gone. I think new technology is always like this. People see something, they're amazed, and then pretty quickly they're like, all right, fine. That was like magic when you first showed it to me. And now I'm just going to complain that it's like slow and doesn't work and has this bug and now it's down. And the period of gratitude is very short. But that's okay. I actually think that says something beautiful about the human spirit. But two years ago, ChatGPT was like 10 days old or something. You know, maybe some people in San Francisco had heard about it. Almost no one had. Most of the world did not think they would be using AI regularly now and trusting it to do things. The people who had heard about AI were like, oh, it hallucinates all the time. It can't do anything. It, you know, confuses dogs and cats, and you got to show it a million examples and whatever. And 2 years on, a lot of people use it for a lot of things. Right. And the world has, I won't say fully adopted it, but figured out pretty well how to deal with the rough edges of this technology, of which there are still many. It's given me new hope that we're going to figure out how to put this into our workflows, even in its very imperfect state. Speaking of that, one of my favorite sections of the book, and one of the things that I'm most hopeful for about AI generally, is when you talk about the impact this can have on scientific discovery. Can you talk about how you think that's going to be going, and or how that will go, and why you think it's so important?
Well, early in the book, as a kind of a warm-up for talking about those application areas, we talked about polymaths. You know, we've always had, over time, human polymaths. For many, many hundreds of years, you know, they operated alone, and they would have effects. Sometimes they scared, you know, the people of the day, too. The reason it's so important to understand this polymathic nature is I think it's ultimately the greatest gift that these machines will bring, is that they will become the general super polymath. Now, when we look back, as we were able to aggregate humans together against big, difficult problems, whether they were just super smart individuals or some of them polymathic themselves, that added something, and they were able to basically come up with new solutions by integrating across these different fields. So when you look at the super intelligent machine, and you realize that it's essentially a general polymath. It knows as much as any human does in every domain, but it's all in one brain. So it doesn't have the communication overhead that humans have.
How far away do you think we are from this?
Well, I think we all, in specific areas, I think we already see it. And so we haven't reached it in every problem domain yet, but I think we see, you know, now or even in the very immediate future, this sort of the beginnings of the benefits of polymathic reasoning across high-dimensional spaces when you want to solve a problem. And I think that that's the thing that and just the efficiencies that are created is what's going to produce this dramatic acceleration in scientific discovery, and I think in the engineering, you know, to realize benefit from those breakthroughs.
I sort of thought the moment that computers felt decisively smarter than us, at least on a wide range of tasks, was going to feel like this momentous moment in history and sort of not just pass by with a whooshing sound and no one really noticing in life going on. And now it looks very much to me like, in some deep sense, that is what's going to happen. In the same way that if we could rewind 2 years or 3 years, we might say, yeah, I don't think the computers are going to pass the Turing test anytime soon. And if they do, it's a big deal. One thing Craig and I have talked about for a long time is that we are on this sort of just exponential ramp of intelligence, and the machines are going to keep getting smarter. There's a lot of issues in addition to the technology we have to solve to make this work. But intelligence on its own is somehow only a very, I don't want to say very small part, but a very incomplete part of what it takes to have the big impact. So you also talk a lot, and you've thought for a long time, about the societal impact of all of this, both in terms of what it's going to take to get the huge benefits. After the science section, the prosperity section was probably the other thing that is most closely aligned with what I hope for these systems, and to mitigate the potential like small negatives, big negatives, geopolitical kind of huge things. Well, I guess before I even get to that question, why do you think more of the world leaders are not taking this, sort of treating it as a more urgent and important problem?
Well, they're busy, like you know. And to some extent, it's a field that they have no intrinsic understanding of. And, you know, for anybody, if you're thrust into a position where you say, well, this is important, but you have no personal grounding in it, I think you wallow in it for a while. You look for other people to coach you or counsel you. But you need to have a direction. I mean, in a sense, the answer in my mind is a bit like, you know, why don't big companies figure out how to make disruptive change regularly? In part, it takes a special kind of person to take a whole bunch of things that may seem disconnected and forge them into something that, as a combination, is important. And then you can have a lot of people try to execute against it. To me, the thing that's missing broadly is there's no blueprint for what governments should do right now to solve the collective set of problems. They haven't distilled out what is the unique role of government in this thing. And so you see overlap in my mind, you know, when we say, well, we want guardrails or rules or whatever it is, but that's highly overlapped with what the companies will intrinsically want to do themselves and are better prepared to. But one of the things I point out to people, in our society, we don't give companies the ability to compel anybody to do anything. That is something we entrust to the government. If you're going to make this stuff work and you want to have uniform trust, and in fact, international trust, the companies can only sort of prime the pump for that by getting adoption of their products because they provide utility. Now, that's how computing has largely been adopted globally, and in fact, I think paved the way for this to go at such an incredible rate. But if anything, it just makes it harder for the government, absent a blueprint, and recognizing this is different, right? This thing is, you know, the ultimate dual-use technology. You know, it can do anything so well that, you know, you can either get a lot of benefit or you can drive it in a bad direction. And so in the end, I don't think we can get an answer strictly by the action of companies. Even if all the companies in the world decided they wanted to collaborate, you know, it wouldn't solve the problem. So there's certain things that we're going to need done uniformly. And what that means is that the government, you can call it regulation, you can call it anything you want, but the governments, plural, are going to have to agree what are the things that must be uniform. And in our businesses, you know, I mean, in fact, software is an interesting thing because if you look back at the history of all the things you use every day, the software parts of those things ultimately do get standardized. But about 99.9% of the time, it gets standardized as a de facto standard because the world's already adopted the products. And then the government say, oh, it's easy. They're all using that, you know, stamp that one, and now everybody can do it that way. We haven't got to that point yet in this AI space, and it brings with it a new class of problems that we haven't shown the blueprint for. And we haven't, despite the adoption rate being so high, it's not uniform around the world yet. And therefore, it's hard to get a consensus through the market for the products on what the right answer is going to be. The companies, just like the countries, are caught in this dilemma, you know, the inevitable co-opetition dilemma. You know, yes, you want to compete, but you better figure out how to cooperate, because if you can't resolve these issues of interoperability and trust, then in the end, you know, it just goes asymptotic in terms of adoption or utility. And I think those are the things that we're not getting done yet.
That is a perfect intro to my question, which I did not preview with Craig, so he's going to be surprised by this too. You become Donald Trump for a week, starting January 21st. In as much specificity as you can, what do you do to make sure this all goes well for the world?
The first thing I would do is recognize that the two countries that are probably going to have to reconcile this co-opetition question the most is going to be the U.S. and China. They're the two places where they got the economic horsepower and the talent and the focus to each, be not that far apart. And so despite the fact that, over the last 20 years, we're in the worst state we've been in terms of geopolitical tension between those two countries, this was sort of Henry's biggest concern. In the book we mentioned, Henry, he got exposed in a meeting that Eric and I had arranged 6 or 7 years ago, to AI broadly. Now, this was, 5 years before ChatGPT hit the world. And Henry, when he listened to this thing, was immediately struck by what its long-term implications were for humanity writ large. And so as he thought about it, and he and Eric and Dan Huttenlocher tried to write a book and talk about what the problems and concerns would be, but it didn't point in a direction about what you might do about it. It was a discussion about that led to this book, because I'd been thinking about it. So if you're Trump and you have to decide what is the strategic thing I have to do, you need to find some way to break the world into several parts. You say, okay, for the U.S., we want to ensure that we get the maximum benefit out of what leadership we can muster in this important technology. At the same time, we have to recognize that if we don't want the world to sort of collapse due to a lack of trust and interoperability, which will affect everyone and every economy, then we're going to have some real outreach. Henry was 95 when he first looked at this, and very rapidly ended up devoting the last 5 years of his life to just this question. And the last trip Henry took, he took in July of 23, and it was to go see President Xi in China. President Xi had asked Henry to come and talk about things, but not AI. And Henry basically said, yes, I'll come and talk as you wish. It'll be my last trip ever, because I'm 100. All right, and it's dangerous for me to make this trip, but I think it's so important to meet, but we must talk about the long-term AI problem. And President Xi agreed to that, and they went and had a trip. He spent 5 days there, and a large part of that time was devoted to this AI question. And so in a sense, Henry would have given President Trump, I think, the same counsel he wanted to give to President Xi, which was, this thing ultimately, will define the legacy of all of your leaderships. And how you handle the disruptive effects of this, not just for China, but for the world, will be ultimately more important than all the things that we're focusing on today. And so in a sense, I would, sort of mirror Henry's view on that for President Trump and say, look, yeah, there's a lot going on, but as the leader, you have to decide that it's important to find the path between initially China and the United States, such that we can, to some extent, set aside a few of the things that are clearly problematic now, but not to the point where we can't figure out what we want to do together.
Is there one specific thing that if China and the United States could agree on for AI over the next decade, you'd feel like, okay, we're on a much better trajectory now?
Yes, I think there has to be, the use of an AI that can be developed completely transparently in the open among any group of countries, but can start with the US and China. And that AI has to be built for the purposes of absorbing, all of the rules and values that the countries have already established, and exploit the polymathic nature of the machine to do what humans have never been able to do, which is to find the points where you can reconcile these things in important areas. So if you want to focus in biology and medicine, or you want to focus in energy or climate, things that you think maybe we have a common interest in, and where the AI could become a key component of getting novel solutions to these problems, then, I would like to believe that they could agree that it would be important to develop an adjudication method that they could both agree to architecturally. That doesn't mean you have to converge a priori on rule sets or, form of government or anything else. I think that's the mistake that generally happens in the past, not in AI, is that, I gave a talk about this stuff in Washington, D.C. to a group of policy people, and along the way, one of them asked me, they said, well, it's great if we can produce all this, and then when we export it, are we going to make sure that all the American beliefs and rules and laws are imposed through our AI on everybody else that we give it to? And I said, no, that's not our job, all right? Our job, much like when we used to build Windows or any operating system, is to basically have it be neutral from a legal and policy point of view, so that it can happily exist in all countries, and each country can then require that it comport with their laws, regs, beliefs, whatever it is. And I think, that is the problem to be solved here, is to not think that this is an enforcement mechanism. It's an architecture to allow trust and collaboration, even if in specific important areas. And if I, had my druthers, and I spent a lot of time in China over the years, and I spent a lot of time in Washington, that's the one thing that I think I would tell the two presidents, and it's the same thing Henry, would have told them.
Changing topics a little bit, what do you think we're all going to be doing with our days 10 years from now?
With our days?
Yeah.
Well, hopefully I'm not going to be working as hard as I've been working. But
like, how different does work look? How different does sort of social life look?
it's hard for me to know how rapidly the transformation happens. The one thing, techies like us are generally overly optimistic about is, what the asymptote is going to be, and we kind of guess right where it ends up, but we always usually underestimate how long it takes for society to actually adjust to these things. So, but I think we'll certainly be into the stage where we're going to have to start asking ourselves some fairly direct, short-term questions, but also some very profound ones. In the book, we talk about thinking that human relationship to the superintelligent machines is going to have to go through 3 stages. Stage 1 is the one we're in now. It's where we use it as a tool. Everything humans have always done when we invent anything, it usually gets used as a tool to amplify our capabilities. This one is the first one that is really different because it's going to exceed our capabilities, and therefore we're going to, and I personally believe we're going to wake up one of these days in the not too distant future and realize, except for the fact that it's not carbon-based biological in nature, it's a new species. It meets all the other tests, or you can see how it would. And then humans have to realize, wow, there's another smart thing here. In fact, it's smarter than us. To me, the good news is it didn't come on a spaceship. We're building it. And that is a real advantage, because if we are wise, we'll engineer these things in a way that ensures that there's a time for human and machine relationships to evolve, to ease the disruption that's going to come. But and I think during that period, this thing is sort of a super machine. And at that point, whether it's the economy or work or biology, we have to decide, what do we want this thing to help us do that we couldn't have done by ourselves? Now, about that same time, if people like Jeff and Elon, do their other space tricks well, they're both saying, well, we should be a spacefaring species, and Jeff talks about thinking we should have more humans off the rock than on the rock eventually. If that's going to happen, we have to think, well, okay, how do we prepare for all that? And these machines may be able to allow us to do that. And then eventually, we have to decide what is the path to coevolution. How does the machine continue to evolve? How do humans continue to evolve? And what is the ultimate symbiosis that you want, and how does that get achieved? I don't think we can know the answer to that a priori, but I absolutely believe it'll go down that path.
I think Earth is really great.
Earth, yeah.
I mean, I'm happy for Elon to leave. That's fine. But I think in general, we may send the robots off. AI can go off exploring, but I think Earth is a very special place.
It is. But some people thought, Europe was a great place, and they still got in the boat and came over here. So,
and some people will, for sure. Good. I hope they have a great time. You talk in the book about prosperity from AI, and this is something I think the level of prosperity we're heading towards is like unimaginable. How has your thinking about what that's going to look like evolve, and how do you conceptualize like how far this can go?
I think one of the things that I sort of agree with, I think it was Dario Amodei recently wrote a paper in it. He talked about his view of how much acceleration you were going to see in scientific and engineering terms. And I think it was something like he said, when this really gets cooking, it may produce a 20x improvement, not a 20% improvement. And so the way to think about that is if everything that humans would do under the current course and speed for the rest of this century, got a 20x speed up after the AI got powerful enough, then everything we would have done by the end of the century will get done by 2035. And from that level of acceleration is where the abundance comes, because no matter what problem you have, your ability to tackle it on a super accelerated basis is just going to be unlike anything we've ever seen before. And I think trying to be prepared, to accommodate that rate of change. When I first met Kissinger 26 years ago, he didn't know anything about computing at all, pretty much. And he came to Microsoft, and we talked about personal computing and the phone and other things as they were evolving. And at the end of the first day we had that conversation, he said to me, this is the biggest thing since the printing press. The printing press ultimately created, the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and ultimately even the Treaty of Westphalia and the nation state as we know it all was essentially triggered by that. He said, this computing thing seems like it's going to have the same effect. He says, my concern is Europe, it was transformational, but it took 300 years. He says, this thing is going to happen a lot faster. Just from computing itself, we've seen those effects, through the internet and social media and every other application. And now you lay this on top of that, and you say, well, wow, that's going to be even faster. The big challenge is going to be disruption. How do we manage disruption? Our institutions have never been engineered to deal with these kind of change at this kind of speed. And what usually has happened historically is when you get into these predicaments, things get chaotic. And out of the chaos, something emerges. The question is, can we recognize that this, will be highly disruptive and decide how do we want to attempt institutionally to prepare the path? And I think these are the things that as societies we have to really put a lot more energy into.
I'm going to start interleaving some of these because the questions are really good. In his recent talks, Geoff Hinton has stressed the importance of creating benevolent AI. How can we create benevolent AI? And do you think this is critical as well?
I'm sorry, who said that?
Geoff Hinton.
Oh, okay.
The reason I ask this is Craig was the first person to articulate to me what I thought was a plausible path to do this.
Well, to me, the way that you get a benevolent AI and also buy ourselves the time to figure out our long-term relationship with it is to have a system that not only understands the rules that humans have already sort of written down, but also learns something about what the cultural anthropology people call the doxa. And I didn't know what that was until a couple of years ago when I started trying to think about this. And I always worried, if the AI is going to do things that humans can't anticipate and may not even understand, then the idea that we're going to write rules to keep it, benevolent and beneficial kind of doesn't work. And so the thing I was fascinated by when we studied this doxa concept is it's a word that describes a set of very foundational moral and ethical, called beliefs that all humans seem to have in a quite uniform way. They've studied it enough to know two things: that you're not born with it, it's not innate, and you can't really write it down in some uniform way. But when you test people on it all over the world, particularly when they're young, they all seem to have this common thing. So it's like a folkloric thing, but very, very uniform. The good news for me was it's learned. And therefore, if it could be learned by children, then there's no reason I think that the machine can't learn it too. And therefore, you can ensure that there's sort of a grounding under what these things do that is more intrinsically aligned with what humans really think is benevolent than anything that people have been able to articulate. And if you couple that with its ability to understand all the rules and regulations that humans have ever written down, because that's a tiny drop in the bucket compared to what you train these machines on broadly. That it was the belief that we could have an AI that would do that made me think, yes, there's a path to basically getting the benefits and dramatically reducing the risk of downsides.
Seems surprisingly plausible to me, given what we've learned about how these systems can learn and how we can get them to follow from a relatively small amount of additional training data.
One of the things that's funny, when I first started, I brought you this idea a while ago, and I was like, yeah, but it's so out there, and we're so busy. And that was the answer I got from every government and everybody else. And everybody said, well, why don't you try to build one? So we did. And when we got down to this question of learning the doxa, we had to decide, is there some way to approximate what that might be? And it turned out some of the clever people that were working with me on this little experiment said, well, okay, if they're learning it from their parents, and their family members when they're really young, are there any artifacts that parents use when they're talking to their kids? And it turned out we said, aha, fables, all right? And so we went out and we got a couple of 100 fables and kind of weeded out the ones that seemed bizarre. And then
some of them are pretty weird.
Yeah. And so we just took the ones that were sort of not sort of weird, and we actually trained a model on those fables, and we took them from multiple countries. And then we used it to basically govern, the behavior of another existing model. And so we could A/B test it, where you could ask a model a certain question where you didn't have any of this grounding, and it would kind of give you random stuff sometimes. But if you said, hey, no, I don't want you to violate this, did it behave better? And it did. And in fact, what was fascinating is even though when you look at fables through this lens, you realize each of them tends to try to teach children some fairly narrow concept of good, bad, evil, good, evil, whatever it is. And so we fed it a bunch of these things. And when it was done, we realized we could actually ask it fairly complex moral reasoning questions, and it would answer them. And so I was buoyed up considerably by that little experiment because, in a sense, it's how we grow up. Our mom reads us a bunch of fables when we're little, and we experience the rest of the world, and we meet more people, and then you become more of a reasoning person yourself, but you're still grounded in those things. And the fact that we could do that experiment with the models of today, and that it actually learned some of these complex moral and ethical things and could compound them, was fascinating. But for me, very, positive in thinking that we can, in fact, imbue these machines as we build them, while they're young, with these things that no one has to agree a priori, have to be written down. They're not the rule sets of the US, the UK, Canada, China, or anybody else. It's just an underpinning architecture that you can say is common by and large to all humans.
What's the most important skill for humans to develop in an AI-dominated world?
Anything you can do to increase your comfort with curiosity and risk. These are attributes in my own 50 years of doing R&D, to find the people who tend to be the ones that will go out and make new things happen. And we're just going to need a lot more people to decide to take some risk, be curious and take some risk in trying to think, what can I do with this capability? And how can I make that into something that helps everybody else? And, unfortunately, when I've studied this, the percentage of people who naturally are sort of high on these two scales of curiosity and risk is only about 0.5% of the population. Now, that's why, to some extent, entrepreneurship, and those who succeed, not everybody can do it. But I think the demand for entrepreneurship in the face of this magnitude of disruption is going to be unbelievably high. And if people can, think about it and encourage or participate early in these processes, I think it'll help to alleviate the disruption.
For people in their mid to late part of their careers, what skills should they learn to stay abreast with the pace of AI innovation?
The thing I think is great about AI, no matter kind of what stage you're in, is it reminds me of the early days of the personal computer when the spreadsheet, emerged. Because it was sort of the first time people who didn't know how to program could get the computer to do something that was sort of algorithmic, that they thought they understood how it was doing it. And it got, even to this day, it's become a hugely valuable tool. It was programmerless. Interestingly, the AI, long sought, only happened when we gave up trying to write the rules for how it did it and just let it learn it.
I think about this all the time.
And so then you say, okay, then the next step is, as this thing has gotten smarter and it's gotten so I can talk to it and it talks back and it's more like interacting with a person, the most important skill people need to have is comfort in changing their primary mode of interaction with these things, to treat it more like they would, be treating another human expert. The other thing I think that we collectively need to do better is to make people understand that the machine doesn't start with as much context as most of the people every day have when you're interacting with them. And that context is super important in terms of getting these things to yield real value easily. And so, if you can learn to spend the time with the machine, and as we get agentic and you have personal agents, that'll become a more intimate process, and I think that'll be good. But, as you and I were talking, different people read the book, some get freaked out, some get excited. And, I think the most important thing is to be open-minded at this point and recognize, yep, it's going to be a big change, and but it might extend all of our lives, and you should think positively and then hope that some small fraction of the people involved in this, both in the development side and on the governments, will actually move quickly enough to create the foundation that'll allow all this to happen in a good way.
How do you use AI in your everyday life?
A number of ways. I'm not writing code anymore, so I don't happen to use it for code writing, but I write a lot of documents and mails. The other thing, is that I use it for quite a bit is I have a bunch of thoughts, or I'm going to go give a talk somewhere. I did one of these recently where somebody said, come and be on a panel discussion like the one we're doing here, but a bigger group. And they said, please write us a 1-paragraph, description of the stuff you want to talk about on this panel. So I mailed that in. In the morning, I got up before the panel. I said, it would be nice to have some notes to make sure that I'm complete when I offer my remarks. So I just took the paragraph I wrote, pasted it in to the ChatGPT Copilot thing in PowerPoint, and said, convert this paragraph into 10 slides that sequence the things that I want to talk about. And in 20 seconds, I had a complete PowerPoint deck, including illustrations, which it chose that actually matched, and some of them it drew, that matched the concepts that I had mentioned in this one paragraph. And I said, that's pretty good. I threw 2 of the slides away, took it out there, and it was the map of my talk. And so, whether it's writing things, the other thing, I don't search anymore for anything. I just state my problem and, what I'm trying to do and let it go assemble answers. Perhaps the biggest thing I use it for is medicine. I'm very involved in biology and medicine. I've got a lot, I'm in my 70s. Turns out I have a lot of friends that are not completely healthy anymore. And this thing is an unbelievable tool, for helping individuals understand what's going on, with their medical care. And, I think this is sort of really the first true killer app for this stuff at that scale, is because everybody wants to be well. The healthcare system is struggling, frankly, with the rate of change in technology and biology and medicine, and the system doesn't have time to educate you. And these things are incredible tools for doing that, particularly when you recognize, to me, this is just a great example. In the 100-odd years since Hopkins created the first medical school, we've made huge progress in biology and medicine. And now we understand things at some level that we didn't before. But we still don't understand it at the molecular level. And we never will without the machine. And so if you look at it now, medicine has become an area of increasingly narrow specialization. Why? Because humans only have so much time to learn, study, and keep up to date. And as the field gets bigger and bigger, they have to take a smaller and smaller slice. But unfortunately, biologically, we're one big, complicated, interconnected system. So when you chop us up and try to deal with us medicinally, from a health point of view, as little piece parts, it doesn't really work very well. And so what's fascinating is when you take these things and you feed all of the things about your health into every record you've got, every scan you get, et cetera, it puts Humpty back together again. And it'll explain to you at any level of depth you want what's going on. And it'll actually, help you develop questions that you can then talk to your healthcare provider about, and you're just wildly more prepared and educated. And so probably more than anything else, for myself, my family, and my friends that are having problems, teaching them how to use this, not doing it for them, but teaching them how to use it, is just an incredibly gratifying experience. And I recommend it to everybody.
Every day I get a ton of emails from people saying I was really sick and I had this set of symptoms, couldn't figure out what it is, put my symptoms and my test result in ChatGPT and told me, and I went to a doctor and I'm cured. And it's very gratifying.
It is. Well, and it's gratifying that it does it, but for those of us that are involved in trying to build this stuff, it's gratifying to see, the light go on for people.
Yeah.
And the gratitude that they feel, because this is something, it's the ultimate personal problem. And, I'm working with some other people now. One of the really underexplored or certainly underperfected area of health is mental health. And I think this is, of course, we now know one of the areas of incredible potential, but also incredible risk because of the intimate relationship that the machine rapidly can develop with a person. And, this is one that I think, is going to be incredibly powerful because we don't have any good way to deal with the mental health crisis broadly. And I believe this is the vehicle to deal in large measure with that. But it's going to require real focus to figure out how to get that to be a good thing.
I work in climate change and am very concerned about the energy consumption of AI. Thoughts?
I'm a true believer in fusion. Sam and I have a combined common interest in one specific fusion activity, which we think is going to surprise the world by showing, fusion electrical generation within the next year. And so while most of the experts in the world are still focused on sort of the classic tokamak and other type architectures, I think, as has happened in other fields, a small team of people who take a completely different approach are going to surprise everybody. And when that happens, and because of the nature of fusion, it has no explosion risk, it has no atomic fuel input, has virtually no atomic radioactive output, and that's because of the specific nature of this approach. Some fusion things do have some of those problems, but this one doesn't. And we've already managed to get regulatory approval for it that says, this thing's not any more dangerous in your community than your local hospital with a PET scanner. And I think that will become the basis of a radical transformation of the energy system and the ability to deploy it rapidly on a global basis. And it'll be cheap power. And because of that, most of the climate change problem will be solved through the derivative benefit that comes from having, manufacturable cheap electricity at scale.
What kind of impact do you think and perceive AI will have on education?
My own belief is that if you go back in time, before the printing press, the only way people learned was by a sort of a Socratic teaching method. They had a tutor, a personal teacher. And when the printing press happened, there became, an explosion in the ability to distribute information or knowledge at the time in books. And then a lot more people wanted to get formally educated, but there was no way to scale it up on the teaching side. So instead, we took the Model A Ford, manufacturing approach, and that's the classroom that we currently all have and went through. It's not great. It's gotten us a long way, but I think that we really should be thinking that there's two processes that have to be considered separately. One is actually teaching you something and giving you mastery of knowledge in a field or broad set of fields. And the other is socialization. And today we depend a lot on the school as the place where you get the education and the socialization. But if you look today, at least for a lot of young people, almost, in my opinion, to an extreme, the socialization is also happening outside of school through sports activities and other things. So if I could wave my wand, I would say there should be a wholesale shift to where every kid from an early age has a personal Socratic teacher, and that the parents and what we institutionalize as the education system should focus on sort of the combining of kids in problem solving and socialization, but that'll require a radical redo of the education system.
Yeah, if you watch like a very self-driven, curious kid use AI today, it's really quite remarkable.
It's totally
what they do on their own, even without someone having built these systems. I agree. Most kids aren't like that. We'll have to build it in a way that is appealing to all kids, and we'll need people to help them, and sort of teachers will play this critical role. But if you just look at the kids that this already is really resonating for, clearly the spark of something great is there.
Yeah. Well, and I think the driven ones, I mean, even with things like the Khan Academy, before the AGI integration, the driven kid, could go there and accelerate dramatically their learning. People who helped them a little bit could do remedial work in that environment that they weren't able to get in school. And I think that, this should move all of that forward. And hopefully, the driven person will be able to go wildly farther than they have before. But the average, just normal person, I think, should be able to find the educational experience much, much more personalized and comfortable than they do today. And hopefully, you'll just get an aggregate better result that way.
All right, here's the question that I get asked most often, and then I get to ask it to Craig. What suggestions would you give to parents with young children in this era of AI? Do they need to learn coding at all? How do we assure them they won't be jobless? Smiley face.
The coding question, I don't think they really need to be expert coders, because I think that it'll become implicit that if code needs to be created to effect a particular function, whether it's operating something in the physical world or doing a particular problem-solving thing, that the machine will be able to generate the code merely being asked, what problem you're trying to solve. So there was a woman from Carnegie Mellon who worked at Microsoft, and she ended up going to the National Science Foundation. And her big thing was what she called computational thinking. And that is a thing I think is important. Not in the sense that you want to become a great generator of algorithms and code to implement those algorithms, but it's sort of a step beyond critical thinking. And people who often argued for broad liberal arts education are trying to say, we don't want you to be specialized in anything. We want you to be a critical thinker. We can give you anything and ask you to contemplate it. But I think in the highly technical world that we're going to be operating in, that, from an early age, the more you can encourage kids to develop this sort of computational thinking in addition to classic concepts of critical thinking, is the best way to ensure that they, to the extent that people need jobs in the future, they'll be able to do one. The thing that's going to change, what's going to change is the nature of work is going to be dramatically different in the future. And I don't think we know exactly what that means and how it'll affect everybody, but it's clearly going to change. And so people who have the ability to flex, with the opportunity, or in fact, if you end up not having to work as much as we've all had to work, you still want to be able to think, what do you use your intellectual capacity for? And I just think flexibility is going to be very important.
I think the world is unbelievably confused on whether we want people to work less or more.
Right. Well, in the book, you may recall, Sam, that one of the things that we say in the book that we think has to be done is we have to redefine dignity. it turns out dignity, the belief, that you add value as a person in many different ways, whether it's raising kids or, plowing the fields or writing code for OpenAI, that has been a very important thing. And in our thinking about this, we conclude that the things that drove this historical view of dignity is going to have to be redefined. And we have to find the new set of things that people will, themselves feel, this is what makes me valuable. This is what I contribute. And that change is going to happen.
For what it's worth, I feel optimistic on this point. We've gotten through many transitions in human history. It seems like the things that make us feel useful and valued and fulfilled, there's a lot of deep truths to that don't change very fast. So the nature of what we consider work will be very different, but the nature of what work looked like a few hundred years ago was very different too. And if those people could look at us now, they'd probably look at you and I and say, that's not a real job. You're entertaining yourself, playing some game, whatever. But, that doesn't really count. And I hope the people in the future say that about us.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope they have great lives. And that seems fine to me. All right. We are about out of time, and there are a lot of good questions here. I'm not going to get to.
Pick a few winners.
I tried to rank them, but there are a lot of good ones. AI relies on lots of human-created content. How can we design a system that helps these creators get fairly compensated for their contributions?
In a sense, I think the whole balance, for example, in copyright and what emerged there in the fair use doctrine probably has to be re-examined in this environment. Not being an artist at all, but looking at this question, when I look at the artists, and this comes, I guess, because I'm so rooted in this idea that, we are basically like the parents of a prodigy. Yeah, and, we want that prodigy to be able to grow up and do as much as he or she can do. And so since I think of things in that viewpoint, when somebody tells me that this intelligent thing, which I think, we'll decide is really kind of a new species, that we should take our historical work products or art, or whatever it is, and withhold it from them, simply because if I show it to them, they can do things like it. I struggle with this because I said, how did you learn? You went to art school. They showed you all the famous paintings, and yep, you can even try to copy them. But hopefully, you do things that are more unique. And I think that these machines are the same way. The thing that's important, and I don't think people articulate enough, is if you take anybody's painting, whether it's a Picasso or some new game art designer today, and you show it to a person in art school and say, you want to learn how to do things like this, they say, yeah, show me that, show me more of that, and teach me how to do that. When they show it to the machine, and the machine, does things just like it, or in that vein, or even something that looks remarkably similar to it, they think it's a perfect copy. They don't understand that, unlike your PC, where you can take this bit string called a JPEG or something, store it on the disk drive, and get it back and get the same thing absolutely every time. When you store this thing in the brain of the AI, it's storing it like it does in our brains by and large. There's no little disk file in there that has every bit, It actually learns the picture, breaks it into component parts, and when you ask for it, it reassembles a picture that's like the one that you saw. To me, this is a very important distinction, because in that regard, it's a lot more like teaching a person who wants to understand the art, than it is about what started with the Xerox machine problem. I mean, before the Xerox machine, we didn't have a fair use problem. And when we got a Xerox machine, we decided we needed to have a fair use doctrine, and that became law. I think we're going to now say, okay, well, this thing isn't a Xerox machine, but what is it that we want to do to ensure that it doesn't, completely eliminate the demand? But frankly, why is art any different than law? My friend Stan here is a lawyer. You can look at anybody in the room and say, how's this going to affect my job? And the answer is, I don't know yet, but it will. And so everybody's going to have this problem.
On that note, thank you, Craig, for this conversation and the book.
Thanks, Sam. It's been great.